welcome to the Fish Blowout 2023 Impacts to Urban Fisheries along the Wasatch Front. Our speaker is going to be Ben Willardson. He is an assistant professor at Utah Valley University, teaching civil engineering for the past 5 years, and he has also worked as a professional engineer in the water resources and stormwater management sector side of things for the past 18 years. So over to you.
Great, thank you. So I appreciate you guys showing up to my lecture today. Hopefully you're all interested in fish because that's what we're here to talk about. So as was mentioned, I teach engineering. I've been an engineer. So this conference I love coming to because you've got a variety of people with policy planners, Forest Service, you know, the whole spectrum. I've worked in the whole industry, so I've done hydrology, hydraulics, sediment transport, debris flows, fish passage, stream restoration projects. I love it all, but during my off time, I am a biologist. I go out and I sample the fish populations and look at the macroinvertebrate population. So this is me moonlighting as a biologist. So take this presentation, if you're biology people, you can call me on it because I'm not a biologist, this is what I do for fun. But I noticed a big change in the fishing this year along the streams that I fish here in Utah County mostly, and thought I would share that with people that were interested, because how the urban environment responds to these large flooding events is important. How we design for our urban channels plays a factor in that impact throughout multiple seasons. So we'll talk a little bit about Hobble Creek and the Provo River. Those are the two main rivers I fish. Urban areas because they're close to home and close to work. So my students know sometimes I take some time and I go sample during the week. But we'll also talk about stream considerations and fisheries management, how what happened this year could be informing decisions we make in the future. So let's talk about our flows. This year, you all know we had a state of emergency for flooding. We dodged a bullet because we didn't get heavy spring rainfall on top of our heavy snowpack, which helped us keep most of the channels within their flood banks, although they were running quite full. We had a 40-day stretch of continuous peak floods. Most of you may not remember the floods of 1983. I do. I was about 7 or 8. Our water supply system in town was washed out. The news was showing flooding down the streets of Salt Lake. So when this year's snowpack was high, I was thinking, oh, this is going to be a good one. Luckily, we dodged that bullet. But with our record-breaking snowpack, we had extreme runoff and longer durations of flow than we often expect. So let's talk about what that does to our fisheries, especially in urban areas where we have highly channelized flow systems. We have habitat disruption, issues with recruitment, which deals with fish growth and spawning, and how water quality also impacts that. So habitat disruption, we have altered physical structures, we have erosion impacts to spawning grounds, we have displacement of vegetation, and we have food web impacts. So the altered physical structures, most of you, well, hopefully you all know, fish can't swim against the current forever. They have to take a break sometimes. They need either large woody debris, rocks and boulders, undercut banks, places where the flow is slow so that they can rest and recover from getting their food or doing their spawning. The stream beds in our urban areas, specifically Hobble Creek and the Provo River, are mostly cobblestone beds. That happens because as the flow energy comes through, it washes out all the fine sediments and leaves the bigger rock, and they're resistant to erosion. Over time, with different flow levels and varying things happening in the streams, you get deeper pockets, you get shallow bar depositions. During this storm event, a lot of that structure just got washed, wiped flat. So now instead of having pools and pockets, now you just got a flat cobblestone bed that doesn't allow for a lot of resting and hiding for the fish. When that sediment moves, trout specifically like to spawn in gravelly areas. That means not cobble and not silt. They have to have, sands and gravels where they can go in, make their little redds, and then lay their eggs and fertilize them. When this bed gets washed out and all that's left on top is cobblestones, it has an impact on where they can spawn, because they say, well, this doesn't look right. I can't do my stuff here. I got to go find another place. Besides that, does anybody know when trout spawn? Depends on the species. Yeah. So rainbow trout and cutthroats spawn in the spring. The rainbows between May and June. The cutthroats, because they're usually higher up, usually between May and July. The German browns spawn in the fall. So the German browns that spawned last fall thought everything looked great. They spawned, laid their eggs, little fish hatched. They're little, right? So this spring, when the floods came, they were only about 2 inches long. Do you think those little 2 inchers can handle 20 feet per second? They cannot. How about the rainbow trouts when they wanted to lay their eggs? Oh yeah, let's make our red, do our thing. Oh, here comes the heavy high water, and where do all the eggs go? Utah Lake or somewhere else, right? They get disturbed out of their nest. So that has an impact on their spawning. Displacement of vegetation, right? Do we have a lot of growth of vegetation in our urban channels? Not much. What little we have, can establish during or after these big events, but then during the big events, a lot of that gets washed out. These vegetation areas are important because they allow roughness, friction, and turbulence in the water, breaks up that flow velocity and gives the fish a place to hide. So when that washes out, they have less place to hide from these high flows. And then the last impact, these food web impacts, what do the fish eat? Usually it's the bugs that grow on the bottom of the rocks, but when all these rocks are rolling down the system because of these high velocity events, the bugs get scraped off and washed out of the system as well. And so then the availability of food after this high flood event becomes less. So for spawning recruitment, we have these issues with the survival rate of the eggs for the rainbow and cutthroat trout. The juvenile browns also have problems because they can't withstand those high flows. And that leads to an imbalance in age class for reproduction, right? So the fish of this year, what we call young of year, are between 2 and 4 inches. About 4 inches per year. So by the time they're 2 to 3 years old, they're ready to spawn. So in 2 to 3 years, if all the little fish got washed out this year, we're going to have less spawners to replenish the fishery. Do you guys know if fish are planted in the sections of urban river? Anybody have an idea on that? They're not. I called, because I'm curious and I was thinking about this presentation, I called the Fish and Wildlife in Springville, Mike Slater. I said, hey Mike, tell me about your urban fisheries and what you're experiencing. He said, oh, we don't monitor urban fisheries because all our money goes to the native fishery areas. We don't plant anything there. So they don't put fish in the urban areas. They expect them to maybe wash out of the mountains during these big events. So I said, well, then how about you tell me about what you're seeing in the wild environments? He said, well, I said, you know, I don't see a lot of fish here. And he said, well, we don't think they're gone. We think they've been redistributed. That's because they don't sample everywhere along the streams. They just sample in a few certain locations. I personally sample a lot of locations on the Provo and Hobble Creek River. It's what I do, right? I get out and check it out. So I'm going to say they're not there. They've disappeared. In the less urban areas up in Hobble Creek and Provo River, there are some things that mitigate these high flows so that the fish populations remain higher in the native areas rather than in the urban areas, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then what about water quality? This is Hobble Creek during May of this year. If you look here, this is the road right here. There's an old masonry retaining wall. They lost a piece of this road here. They haven't replaced it. The road's still closed. But that's one of my favorite fishing areas in all of town because it's easy to get into. But how about this water quality? The fish like that? They don't, right? More sediment, less easy to breathe the oxygen out of it. The high turbidity also increases oxygen, gives more nutrients, but that's not necessarily good for fish, especially trout, because they are a more sensitive species for oxygen. They need higher oxygen levels. So we've got this condition for them where they've got high flows that they can't swim against. They've got dirty water with less oxygen. Their beds are being moved so they don't have any place to spawn, and they really struggled. So after the storm event, we went out, well, I went out. This is that same stretch of river after the storm. This is October of this year. Look at all that vegetation. Looks pretty good, right? So what happens when the water comes up, all those plants that have little seeds sitting in the cracks of that masonry wall started to sprout. So now there's a lot of brush growing along there, but I'm going to show you some of the impacts to that creek. Here are the areas on Hobble Creek. I'll show you this one is down here in the middle of Springville, but we'll start up at the upper end and work our way down. Here's our runoff gauge. So this is our April through June flow rate from the USGS gauge. And we can see this is the flow rate that was I showed in that channel picture with the water quality, that 8-foot level, where things were flowing high velocity for deep water for a long period of time. If you look on the left side, that is our gauge from 2010 through 2023. You can see we were a little bit higher than some of those other maximum flow rates, but this has happened before. It happens not infrequently, 4 times in the last 15 years. So these are episodic events that impact the fish in the system. So here is the area up near 7th East. They just put a new weir and flume in to measure flow rates here for irrigation diversions. So this is the before and after. They had just put in the weir up above. You see my little buddy there, this typical little fish in the Hobble Creek. Behind that weir, they didn't place any rock before the event. After the floods, this much sediment was deposited against the wall. And then if you look under the bridge, there was a lot more cobble deposited under the bridge. This system has a debris dam upstream of the city, so all of this rock that's moving is either bed material or bank erosion material that's come down through the system. Behind that weir wall was about 4 feet deep. It's now filled with rock. So even though there's no sediment supply for the system, the bed has moved and bank has moved and filled in all of this area with sediment. Here's another picture of that Hobble Creek near 2nd East. Looking down the bank, they put in the sandbags, hoping to prevent flooding through town. They didn't quite get there. Here's what we look like. On the left is October 2022, and on the right is our current October 2023. If you look closely, you can see where these red circles are. Those are drop structures. Those are big boulders that allowed water to spill over, form a pool. The fish were always resting in the pools. That's where they would congregate to eat. In this reach, I would normally catch 7 to 10 fish in an hour. On the right here, if you look closely, you can only see 2 of those drop structures. The other 2 closer to the front washed out during this storm event, and so, or this runoff event, and so we have less pool habitat for the fish to spawn in and to rear in. Now fishing through this reach, I catch 1 or 2. So from 7 to 10 now down to 1 or 2. I also used to catch in this area in June and July the young of year. When I'm fishing with my fly, sometimes I'll catch them, they'll go sailing over my head because they're little, but they were there. This year, no young of year. Any of the times I went fishing on that stretch, there were none available. This is Hobble Creek down near 9th West. You can see the excellent riprap job that was done with slabs of concrete in the past, ripe for a redo, right? Here in the front, in this area, there used to be a 4-foot deep pool that I would fish in, catch 4 or 5 fish. That all filled in with sediment moving downstream through the system as the bed was moving. This area west of the park in Springville is natural. However, there have been some beavers that have moved in. Over the last 10 years, they've formed multiple beaver dams. There's a wide floodplain. This is the only place in Hobble Creek that I've actually caught young of year, and even there, not very many. So even the native areas with wide floodplains still struggled to maintain a fish population in here. And so that's our Hobble Creek section. Provo River, this is the Provo River near JCW University Parkway area. They just did a project for the Central Utah Water Conservation District for some irrigation diversion at that location and changed this river with the riprap there. This is the flow rate for our flow depths for the gauge on the Provo River during our storm event. Here is our data for the last 15 years on the Provo River. So I'm going to correct something here, right? The gauge looks like it needed an adjustment so that it would bring down these base flows down to the current operating levels or expected operating levels. When you do that, you see on the Provo River also extreme flows, but something that still happens cyclically. We still see these kinds of events, you know, a few times a decade. This is the Provo River near the Olmsted Power Plant. In this pool, one of my favorite places to fish, there are usually 100 fish in this pool, walking up from the bottom to the top, trying to catch fish. So that was pre the storm event. Now there is 1 fish in that pool, just 1. Walked it several times, hoping against hope that there would be more fish, but 1 fish from 100 that used to be there. Downstream of this, there are also drop structures that have been washed out from this runoff event. Here in the Provo River, again near University Parkway, this is the before riprap, or before riprapping, after riprapping. This has changed our pool system in this area. There used to be a pool, now there's riprap. Downstream of the University Parkway Bridge, there used to be a large pool over here with fish in it. That's been flattened, so now the bed elevation all along that reach is flat and no hiding structure for the fish to be in. Just upstream of that location, under the walkway bridge, there used to be a tree with a 6-foot deep pool. See people fishing there all the time. Now that is also a flat bed. So all the sediment has moved down through the system, flattened out, and now the fish have less place to hide and do their things. So how does this lead us into discussions of stream restoration, what we need to be thinking about in our urban areas, and how does it influence our fisheries management? So we need to consider sediment sizes. Even though these are cobble bed systems, they still move. So we may need to find ways to anchor some of our structure in a way that prevents it from moving during these events, because we know there's no sediment that's going to replace what is moving. We need to provide that protection structure in a way that keeps this system fishable. Here, if you see on the left-hand side, this was a cobble bed area. You can notice there at the bottom of that wall that there has been scour that's moved the cobble away from the base of the wall. So just having cobble may not be enough. We may have to secure it or have more of a boulder toe than a cobble toe. This is a section upstream in Hobble Creek. What I'll point out here is that we have large boulders that provide roughness and shelter for fish. We have bedrock outcrops that also keep that section consistent over time. We have woody debris that provides shelter, and we have pools for rearing juvenile fish. So this is something that we can look at as a way to protect our fish populations in urban areas. If we have to channelize it, we may need to go with a system that looks more like that native system. That may mean grouting in some of your boulders. It may mean creating some concrete structure that will retain your sediment so that the pool below it doesn't fill in. This section actually has fish, about 7 to 10 an hour, like I would expect down below. Another piece of Hobble Creek upstream, here you can see we still have some rock that's bigger in the channels that provide hiding places, create pools, but then we've got that overbank area that allows the floodwater to rise, spread out, slow down, with vegetation up there that provides shelter for the small fish during these high flow events. This area also is fishing about the same as it did prior to the flood event. Provo River, this is the Provo River just upstream of Olmsted where it's natural still. This one is also still fishing about the same as it did pre-storm, where we have flow splits, islands, large rocks, pools that have maintained habitat structure for the fish to survive these larger flow events. All right, so here are some structures that we can look at in our urban areas to provide habitat against these larger events. We've got these cross veins that provide pooling, keep some edge flow areas with reduced velocities, and channel that flow into the center so that the fish have a place to hide. Those may need to be concreted in areas where we're not getting sediment or the cobble is moving and filling up our pools. We have cross veins and J hooks. We've got walls for protection that we can consider, or we've got these natural riprap drop structure pool systems to help create some of that habitat that the fish need. We can also do this with woody debris, large wood. We've got root wads and debris fields, staked in logs. Who knew that urban Provo has a beaver problem? Anybody? Yeah, so the beavers are great for putting woody debris into your river, but if you don't have a wide riparian habitat, that becomes problematic because pretty soon all your woody debris disappears. I was fishing on the Provo River one day, and a guy came up and said, "Hey, have you seen any beavers while you've been out here fishing?" I said, "I really haven't." He said, "Well, last night they cut down 8 trees on our property." So, you know, if you don't have a lot of trees, that's a big deal. So we need to look at how we can provide this structure and prevent it from blowing out so that the fish have places to hide during our design processes or redesign. When we have structures that fail in an urban environment and we have to go in and do an emergency repair, we should consider what are some things we can do to provide structure that will last through these events. So how does this impact fisheries management? We can take advantage of these lower fish populations during blowout if we want to reintroduce native species, right? A lot of times they treat with rotenone, do several treatments to kill the fish, and then reintroduce the population. However, when we have a fish blowout, we can introduce larger native fish that will then go in and eat the rest of the little non-native fish and speed up that replacement process. We need to keep in mind that as we're managing our urban channels, we can do things that help protect the fish, provide structure, and since the DNR doesn't necessarily devote resources to restocking these areas, the efforts that we make will be important to the fish populations throughout the urban system. And then Mike Slater from the Fish and Wildlife, or DNR, asked me to advocate this since we're looking for ways to augment flows to the Great Salt Lake. Remember, fish need water in the streams. I went to fish one of the creeks here in Salt Lake County one day. I think it was after a conference like this. Showed up and there was no water in the stream, therefore no fish, so I couldn't sample the population. I was a little disappointed, but as we're trying to influence the Great Salt Lake water levels, we can keep flows in the streams and increase our urban fish populations. All right, thank you. We've got time for a couple of questions, it looks like.
You mentioned them briefly, but what is the purpose of the J-hook structures?
The J-hook structures will push the flow away from your bank and redirect that higher velocity flow out into the center of the channel and leave that slower velocity near the edge.
I was just curious, with the flooding that's been going on in the roads and things, have you found that because of the salting that's going on for ice being pushed into the streams has caused any other degradation or to the fish population?
As far as, I haven't noticed any like post-winter, you know,
Sure.
storm runoff impacting the fish significantly in the urban areas. I'm sure it does over the long run, but it's not degrading the fish population like the blowout has.
How are you keeping that woody debris in your stream during floods?
Yeah,
and
that's a great
blowout?
question. So during floods, you can anchor it down with cables and tie it down. If you plan to have that be a permanent structure, then you would anchor it down. If you keep the log below the minimum water level, they don't rot out. But if it's subject to wetting and drying, you'll get the dry rot over time. So it kind of depends on how you want to manage that. If you want it to be there for a few years, you would just anchor it down. Don't worry about the flow. If you want it to be there for a long time, you need to keep it submerged. I think there was one more question.
So I was just wondering, since a lot of our urban streams are diverted and more direct, is it helpful to add in those meanders back in? Does that help with flooding, or disrupting?
Usually the meanders are on the low flow, and you'll have that higher upper bank that takes the high flow. So if you've got enough room to have a lower flood area with the meander and an upper flood plain, it does help, because as the water rises, it spreads out and slows down. But at some point, in most urban areas, at some flood level, it's going to run bank to bank and fairly fast.
All right, thank you so
All
much,
right,
Ben.
thank you for coming.